long before Lestat, long before the vampires of modern nights, there was a man who lived in a world that no longer exists. His name was Marius de Romanus. He was born during the time of the Roman Empire, when the world looked nothing like it does today. There were no modern cities, no electric lights, no machines, no endless roads crossing continents. The Roman world was enormous, powerful, and constantly changing. And somewhere inside that world, a young man was growing up who would eventually become one of the oldest vampires still walking the earth. But his story did not begin with blood. It began with knowledge. Marius was educated. He was intelligent. He was fascinated by history, philosophy, art, and the beliefs of ancient peoples. He belonged to a world where knowledge was precious. Books had to be copied by hand. Stories traveled through human memory. Ancient secrets could disappear simply because the people who knew them died. Marius understood the value of preserving knowledge, and that would become one of the defining features of his immortal existence. But there was something he could not possibly have understood while he was still human. Somewhere in the ancient world, there were beings who had already lived far beyond the normal human lifespan. Vampires. And among them were two creatures surrounded by legends older than Marius could imagine. Akasha and Enkel. They were not ordinary vampires. They were among the oldest known vampires in the world, and they were connected to a mysterious ancient force that had existed before Marius ever entered their story. Marius did not begin his life knowing any of this. He was simply a human being, a scholar, a man living in a dangerous and changing world. Then his life took a completely different direction. Marius eventually became a Roman scholar and was later sent away from Rome. He traveled, he studied, he continued searching for knowledge, but eventually his path crossed with the supernatural. He was chosen, not because he was searching for immortality, not because he had asked to become a vampire. He was taken by force, and his human life ended. Marius was transformed into a vampire by an ancient vampire named Tescamen, who was himself connected to the oldest bloodline. Suddenly, the man who had spent his life studying history became part of history. He no longer had to read about the ancient world. He would live through it. Years would become decades. Decades would become centuries. And Marius would remain. But becoming a vampire did not immediately make him powerful. He had to learn. He had to understand his new body, his hunger, his abilities, his limitations, and most importantly, the terrible responsibility that came with immortality. Marius discovered that vampires were not simply creatures of the night. They had their own history, their own conflicts, their own rules, and somewhere at the center of that ancient history were Akasha and Enkel. The pair had become known as the parents of the vampires. They were kept in a state of stillness and were guarded because of their extraordinary importance. Marius eventually became their guardian. That responsibility would shape almost everything that followed. Imagine what that meant. You are no longer simply a scholar. You are no longer living one ordinary human lifetime. You have become immortal, responsible for protecting two ancient beings whose existence is connected to the origin of your entire species. You cannot simply walk away. You cannot forget. You cannot allow them to fall into the wrong hands. So Marius watched. He waited. He protected them. And while the centuries passed, the human world changed around him. Empires rose. Empires fell. Languages changed. Religions spread. Cities disappeared. New cities were built over old ones. Kings became forgotten names. Marius remained. But immortality came with a price. Every human connection had an expiration date. Every generation eventually disappeared. Every familiar face became a memory, and Marius had to continue. Still watching, still learning, still protecting the ancient pair. At some point, he began understanding something terrifying. The longer you live, the more history stops feeling like something you study. It becomes something you remember. The past is no longer a story. It is your life. And Marius would eventually carry thousands of years of memories inside himself. But before he became the ancient vampire known in later centuries, there was still much more to happen. His relationship with Akasha and Engel would become central to his existence. His search for knowledge would take him across civilizations. He would create new lives. He would love. He would lose. He would build a sanctuary. And he would eventually become connected to vampires whose names would become famous, long after his own story had already begun. But none of that had happened yet. For now, Marius was still learning what it meant to be immortal. He stood between two worlds. Behind him was humanity. Ahead of him was eternity. And somewhere in the darkness, the ancient blood was waiting. Marius had once spent his life trying to understand the mysteries of the past. Now, he had become one of them, and the world had no idea what was walking among it. Marius had already crossed the boundary between human life and immortality. But becoming a vampire was only the beginning. The real burden was waiting for him. He had been entrusted with something almost impossible to understand. Akasha and Engel. The ancient pair were not simply old vampires. They were connected to the very beginning of the vampire bloodline, and Marius had become their guardian. For a creature who had spent his human life searching for knowledge, the responsibility was almost impossible to resist. He had the chance to remain close to beings who carried memories from an age almost completely lost to humanity. But there was also danger. The older a vampire became, the more powerful the vampire could become. And Akasha was older than almost everyone Marius would ever meet. She was not simply another immortal. She was something closer to a living piece of ancient history. So Marius watched. He protected them. He learned, and centuries began to pass. Human civilization changed around him. The Roman world he had once known slowly transformed. Political power shifted. Cities changed. Languages evolved. Old beliefs disappeared while new ones took their place. People who had once seemed permanent became dust. Marius remained. This was the strange curse of his existence. Humans experienced history as generations. Marius experienced it personally. He could remember what others knew only from ancient writings. He could walk through a place and remember what had stood there centuries earlier. He could see a city and remember when it had been smaller. He could hear a language and remember when its words sounded different. Immortality gave him something no ordinary historian could possess: memory without an ending. But Marius was not satisfied simply to remember. He wanted to understand. That desire became one of his greatest strengths. It was also one of his greatest weaknesses, because knowledge can become an obsession. The more Marius learned, the more he wanted to know. Where had the vampires truly begun? What was the mysterious force connected to Akasha and Enkil? Why did their blood possess such extraordinary power? What had happened to the earliest vampires? And how much of the ancient history had already been forgotten? There were questions even Marius could not answer. And the older he became, the more he understood that immortality did not mean omniscience. You could live for centuries and still remain ignorant. You could watch civilizations rise and fall and still encounter mysteries that refused to reveal themselves. Marius continued guarding the ancient pair, but his immortal existence would not remain peaceful forever. The world of vampires was dangerous. Ancient creatures could be jealous. Other vampires wanted knowledge. Others wanted power. And some wanted access to the beings Marius was protecting. Marius understood that the secret could never be treated casually. If the wrong vampire discovered what Akasha and Enkil represented, the consequences could be enormous. So he remained vigilant. But even an immortal guardian could not control everything. Eventually, Marius's own life became intertwined with another important vampire. His name was Avacus. Avacus was an ancient vampire who had his own history and connection to the supernatural forces surrounding the vampire bloodline. Marius encountered him during a period when the ancient world was changing. Their relationship would become important. But Marius's attention always returned to Akasha and Enkil. They were his responsibility, his greatest duty, and perhaps his greatest burden. Think about what it means to protect something for centuries. You cannot take a day off. You cannot retire. You cannot hand the responsibility to someone else and walk away forever. You simply continue, night after night, year after year, century after century. The world changes. You don't. That kind of existence can change the way you see time. A human being might consider 10 years an enormous period. To Marius, 10 years could become almost nothing. A human child could grow into an adult. A city could transform. A political empire could collapse. And Marius would still be there, watching, waiting, remembering. But his immortality also gave him something beautiful. He could preserve things. Art, books, knowledge, stories, human achievements that might otherwise disappear. Marius valued civilization. He was not interested only in blood and violence. He appreciated beauty. He collected knowledge. He surrounded himself with things that reminded him that humanity was worth protecting. Perhaps that was one of the reasons his relationship with Akasha became so important. She represented an ancient power that could look at humanity very differently. Marius saw humans as complicated creatures capable of extraordinary beauty. Akasha's view would eventually become much more dangerous, but that conflict had not yet reached its final form. For now, Marius remained her guardian, and as the centuries continued, another danger began approaching. The ancient world was filled with people who believed in gods, demons, spirits, and supernatural beings. Some of those beliefs were completely wrong. Others were based on fragments of truth. Humans could sense that something existed beyond their understanding. They simply did not know what it was. And Marius had to live among them while hiding what he truly was. He had to move carefully. A vampire could not simply reveal himself. Immortality depended on secrecy. Marius understood this better than most, but he also understood something else. The longer you live, the harder it becomes to remain completely detached from humanity. You inevitably become part of people's lives. You make friends, you form attachments, you create memories, and then they die. Again, and again, and again. That was the cost Marius could never escape. He could protect knowledge. He could protect ancient vampires. He could survive wars and political changes. But he could not prevent every human life around him from ending. So Marius continued forward. His human past became more distant. His immortal identity became stronger. And his responsibility toward Akasha and Enkel became inseparable from his existence. He had started as a man who wanted to understand the world. Now he was guarding one of its deepest mysteries. But Marius did not yet know how dramatically his life would change. The ancient pair would eventually become connected to a conflict that could affect vampires across the world. And Marius would be standing directly in its path. For centuries, he had protected the sleeping ancient ones. Soon, he would have to protect much more than them. He would have to protect the knowledge he had spent his immortal life gathering. And perhaps he would finally discover that guarding the past could be just as dangerous as confronting the future. The centuries did not pass gently. They passed over Marius like waves over stone. One generation disappeared, then another, and Marius remained. He had once measured his life in ordinary human terms: years, seasons, birthdays. Now those measurements meant almost nothing. A decade could pass before he realized how much time had gone by. A century could disappear into memory. And through all of it, one responsibility remained: Akasha and Enkel. Marius continued guarding the ancient ones while the human world transformed around him. He traveled through different lands. He observed civilizations. He collected knowledge. He preserved art and writings. He watched humanity create extraordinary things and destroy them. That contradiction fascinated him. Humans could build magnificent cities and then burn them. They could write beautiful poetry and commit terrible acts. They could love one another deeply and still turn against each other. Marius never stopped studying them, Perhaps because, despite becoming a vampire, he had never completely stopped being fascinated by humanity. He could have abandoned the human world. Instead, he kept returning to it, and every return reminded him of something. He was changing. Not physically. His body remained immortal, but his understanding of life was changing. When he was newly transformed, immortality had seemed like an extraordinary gift. Now, he understood its weight. You begin to realize that everyone around you is temporary. A friend introduces himself. You learn his voice. You learn his habits. You remember his face. Then years pass. He grows old. And eventually, he is gone. You continue. Another person enters your life. The same thing happens. Then again. And again. Eventually, immortality teaches you a terrible lesson. Nothing stays. Not cities. Not kingdoms. Not languages. Not relationships. Not even memories. Because memories can fade too. Marius fought against that fading. He collected knowledge because he understood that forgetting could destroy history as completely as war. He wanted to preserve what humanity created. But the longer he lived, the more difficult that became. There was simply too much. Too many lives. Too many places. Too many events. His own memory became a vast library, and somewhere inside that library, his human self still existed. But it was becoming harder to find. Then came another important chapter in his immortal life. Marius encountered Avicus. Avicus was ancient, much older than Marius, and his existence was connected to the mysterious history of the vampire bloodline. Their meeting would change Marius. For the first time, Marius encountered someone who understood the ancient world from a perspective completely different from his own. Avicus carried his own history, his own experiences, his own understanding of the supernatural. And Marius listened, because Marius had always been a seeker. Even after centuries, he still wanted to know more. But knowledge came with danger. The more Marius discovered about ancient vampires, the more he understood that their history was not peaceful. There had been conflicts. There had been rivalries. There had been vampires searching for power. And at the center of the oldest mystery remained Akasha. Marius continued his duty. He protected her. He protected Enkil. And he watched. But the ancient world was changing. Christianity was spreading through the Roman world. Old beliefs were being challenged. The political structure that had shaped Marius's human life was transforming. The Roman Empire itself would eventually change beyond recognition. For a human being, this would have been an entire lifetime. For Marius, it was another chapter. He watched the world he once knew disappear, and that experience gave him a strange relationship with history. Humans often romanticize the past. Marius could not. He had lived it. He knew that ancient civilizations were not simply beautiful ruins. They were filled with ordinary people, fear, ambition, poverty, love, violence, hope. The past was not a fantasy. It had been real life, and Marius had been there. That made his perspective different from almost anyone else. But there was another side to his immortality: power. As Marius grew older, he became stronger. He learned what his vampire nature allowed him to do. He developed abilities that ordinary vampires could not easily understand. Yet he did not simply become a creature of violence. He remained deeply interested in culture, beauty, knowledge, human achievement. He wanted to create rather than merely destroy. And eventually, that desire would lead him to establish a place of his own, a sanctuary, a home where he could preserve the things he valued, a place surrounded by beauty and knowledge, a place where the ancient world and the modern world could meet. But Marius' story was never going to remain peaceful, because there was always a question hanging over him. What would happen if Akasha ever awakened? For centuries, she'd remained in a state of stillness. Marius guarded her. He did not fully understand what she might become if she returned to active life, but he knew enough to respect her power. And then, the balance began to shift. Marius could not control everything. He could protect. He could observe. He could preserve. But he could not stop the passage of time. He could not stop other vampires from discovering secrets. He could not prevent the ancient blood from moving through history. And he could not remain untouched by the lives of others. His own emotions continued to complicate his existence. He formed relationships. He cared. He loved. And every attachment created another future loss. Yet he kept choosing connection. Perhaps that was what kept him human. Not his body, not his age, his ability to care, his willingness to remain fascinated by life, his refusal to become completely numb. Because after centuries, it would have been easy to stop caring, to look at humans as temporary creatures, to stop learning their names, to stop remembering their faces. Marius did not. He continued watching, continued learning, continued preserving, continued searching for meaning. But the ancient vampires were moving toward a new chapter, and the world around them was changing rapidly. The old secrets could no longer remain completely buried. Marius had spent centuries guarding the past. Soon, the past would begin reaching back toward him, and when it did, he would discover that protecting an ancient secret was one thing. Living through its consequences was something else entirely. Marius had lived long enough to understand that immortality did not make the world easier to understand. It made the world larger. Every century opened another door. Behind it was another civilization, another language, another war, another generation of people who believed their world would last forever. And then they were gone. Marius remained, but there was one thing he refused to abandon: knowledge. He collected it wherever he went. Books, paintings, ancient objects, stories, memories, anything that could preserve a piece of a world that time was trying to erase. Eventually, Marius created a life surrounded by beauty. He did not want to exist like a beast hiding in darkness. He wanted his surroundings to reflect what he valued: art, culture, learning, civilization. He understood that being a vampire did not automatically erase everything human inside him. And perhaps that was he remained different from many others of his kind. He still cared about the world. He still watched humans. He still found their lives fascinating. But there was something else occupying his thoughts. The ancient ones, Akasha and Enkel, remained at the center of his existence. Marius had protected them for centuries. Their bodies remained strangely still. Their existence seemed almost impossible. They were older than almost every vampire Marius had encountered. And because of that, they represented something more than individuals. They represented the beginning. Marius understood that whoever controlled them could potentially influence the entire vampire world. That knowledge made his responsibility even heavier. He could not simply leave them. He could not treat them like ordinary immortals. He had to remain their guardian. And so he continued. But eventually, Marius's world expanded again. He encountered another ancient vampire whose existence would become deeply connected to his own. Avicus. Avicus had lived for centuries before Marius. He carried memories of his own, and his story was tied to a world of ancient beliefs, gods, and supernatural traditions that Marius could only partially understand. The two vampires became connected through their shared existence. Marius was fascinated by Avicus, but fascination was not the same as trust. Immortality teaches caution. When you have lived for centuries, you learn that another immortal can hide more than a human ever could. A human may lie for a day. A vampire can carry a secret for 1,000 years. Marius knew this, so he watched. He listened. He learned. And as he continued living among humans, he also continued changing. He became increasingly aware of the loneliness of immortality, not the simple loneliness of having nobody nearby. Something deeper. The loneliness of knowing that almost everyone you meet will eventually disappear. Imagine watching someone you care about grow old while you remain unchanged. Imagine hearing their voice become weaker, watching their face change, watching their life move toward its natural ending. Then imagine doing it again and again and again. That is what Marius carried. He could not stop time. He could only continue through it. Yet instead of allowing that pain to destroy his ability to care, he continued forming connections. He continued loving. He continued protecting. He continued building. And that became important when another young vampire entered his life. Her name was Pandora. Marius encountered her during the ancient world, and their relationship became one of the most significant emotional connections of his existence. Pandora was intelligent, independent, and powerful. She was not simply someone Marius wanted to possess. He admired her. He cared for her. And for a time, they shared a life together. But immortality does not make relationships simple. Two vampires can live for centuries and still hurt one another. Marius's devotion to his responsibilities created distance between them. His duty toward Akasha and Enkel remained central. Pandora had her own ideas, her own desires, her own way of seeing immortality. Eventually, their relationship fractured, and Marius experienced something he would experience many times across his endless existence. Loss, not death. Something different. The the loss of someone who is still alive, but no longer beside you. It was another reminder that immortality did not guarantee permanence. Even vampires could leave. Even immortals could become strangers. Even endless life could contain endings. Marius continued forward. He returned to his responsibilities. The Ancient Ones still needed protection. The vampire world continued changing. Human civilization continued changing. And Marius remained in the middle of it all, watching, learning, remembering. But the greatest danger was still waiting, because Akasha was not simply an ancient vampire sleeping through history. She was connected to something far more powerful. The blood within her carried an ancient force, and Marius understood that if she ever awakened, the vampire world could change forever. For centuries, he had treated his duty as protection, but gradually, he began to understand that protection could become imprisonment. What if the Ancient Ones were no longer content to remain still? What if Akasha wanted to act? The house of the ancient blood. Marius had lived long enough to understand that immortality did not make the world easier to understand. It made the world larger. Every century opened another door. Behind it was another civilization, another language, another war, another generation of people who believed their world would last forever. And then they were gone. Marius remained, but there was one thing he refused to abandon: knowledge. He collected it wherever he went. Books, paintings, ancient objects, stories, memories, anything that could preserve a piece of a world that time was trying to erode. Eventually, Marius created a life surrounded by beauty. He did not want to exist like a beast, hiding in darkness. He wanted his surroundings to reflect what he valued: art, culture, learning, civilization. He understood that being a vampire did not automatically erase everything human inside him. And perhaps that was why he remained different from many others of his kind. He still cared about the world. He still watched humans. He still found their lives fascinating. But there was something else occupying his thoughts. The Ancient Ones. Akasha and Enkel remained at the center of his existence. Marius had protected them for centuries. Their bodies remained strangely still. Their existence seemed almost impossible. They were older than almost every vampire Marius had encountered. And because of that, they represented something more than individuals. They represented the beginning. Marius understood that whoever controlled them could potentially influence the entire vampire world. That knowledge made his responsibility even heavier. He could not simply leave them. He could not treat them like ordinary immortals. He had to remain their guardian, and so he continued. But eventually, Marius's world expanded again. He encountered another ancient vampire whose existence would become deeply connected to his own: Avacus. Avacus had lived for centuries before Marius. He carried memories of his own, and his story was tied to a world of ancient beliefs, gods, and supernatural traditions that Marius could only partially understand. The two vampires became connected through their shared existence. Marius was fascinated by Avacus, but fascination was not the same as trust. Immortality teaches caution. When you have lived for centuries, you learn that another immortal can hide more than a human ever could. A human may lie for a day. A vampire can carry a secret for 1,000 years. Marius knew this. So he watched. He listened. He learned. And as he continued living among humans, he also continued changing. He became increasingly aware of the loneliness of immortality. Not the simple loneliness of having nobody nearby, something deeper. The loneliness of knowing that almost everyone you meet will eventually disappear. Imagine watching someone you care about grow old while you remain unchanged. Imagine hearing their voice become weaker, watching their face change, watching their life move toward its natural ending. Then imagine doing it again and again and again. That is what Marius carried. He could not stop time. He could only continue through it. Yet instead of allowing that pain to destroy his ability to care, he continued forming connections. He continued loving. He continued protecting. He continued building. And that became important when another young vampire entered his life. Her name was Pandora. Marius encountered her during the ancient world, and their relationship became one of the most significant emotional connections of his existence. Pandora was intelligent, independent, and powerful. She was not simply someone Marius wanted to possess. He admired her. He cared for her. And for a time, they shared a life together. But immortality does not make relationships simple. Two vampires can live for centuries and still hurt one another. Marius's devotion to his responsibilities created distance between them. His duty toward Akasha and Engel remained central. Pandora had her own ideas, her own desires, her own way of seeing immortality. Eventually, their relationship fractured, and Marius experienced something he would experience many times across his endless existence. Loss, not death. Something different. The loss of someone who is still alive, but no longer beside you. It was another reminder that immortality did not guarantee permanence. Even vampires could leave. Even immortals could become strangers. Even endless life could contain endings. Marius continued forward. He returned to his responsibilities. The ancient ones still needed protection. The vampire world continued changing. Human civilization continued changing. And Marius remained in the middle of it all, watching, learning. But the greatest danger was still waiting, because Akasha was not simply an ancient vampire sleeping through history. She was connected to something far more powerful. The blood within her carried an ancient force, and Marius understood that if she ever awakened, the vampire world could change forever. For centuries, he had treated his duty as protection, but gradually, he began to understand that protection could become imprisonment. What if the ancient ones were no longer content to remain still? What if Akasha wanted to act? What if the power that had remained quiet for centuries finally moved again? Marius could not know exactly what the future would bring, but he could feel the weight of history gathering around him. Marius had lived with the knowledge that the vampire world was built upon secrets. Some secrets were small, Some belonged to individual vampires, and some were so ancient that almost no one remained who truly understood them. Akasha was one of those secrets. Marius had spent ages protecting her and Enkel. He had watched over them while human civilization changed around them. He had guarded their resting place. He had treated his duty as something almost sacred. But eventually, the silence ended. Akasha awakened, and when she returned to the world, Marius discovered that the ancient vampire he had protected for so long was no longer simply a figure from the distant past. She had a will, she had desires, and she had ideas about the future of vampires. Akasha believed vampires should no longer remain hidden. She wanted power, she wanted influence, and she wanted the world of humans to change. Marius was confronted with something he had never wanted to face. The being he had protected could become a threat. For centuries, Marius had believed that preserving the ancient ones was his responsibility. Now he had to question whether protecting them had been enough. Akasha's awakening was not simply a personal event. It affected the vampire world. Her presence reminded ancient vampires of the power that existed in their blood, and it drew attention from others who had spent centuries living in secrecy. Marius understood the danger. The vampire world could not simply follow Akasha without consequences. Humans vastly outnumbered vampires. If vampires openly ruled over humanity, the balance between the two species could collapse. But Akasha did not see the world that way. She believed power should belong to those strong enough to take it, and she intended to use her strength. Marius had to decide where he stood. He had lived long enough to understand that power could destroy the person holding it. He had seen rulers become tyrants. He had watched people who believed themselves invincible eventually fall. Akasha was different. She possessed an ancient power that made ordinary rulers seem insignificant. And now, she wanted to use it. Marius was no longer simply a guardian. He had become a witness to a dangerous transformation. The vampire world was entering a new age, and Marius knew that his own history was about to become connected to vampires far younger than himself. One of those vampires would eventually become extraordinarily important. His name was Lestat, but before that connection fully developed, Marius continued trying to understand what Akasha intended. He could not simply erase her. He could not undo centuries of history, and he could not pretend that nothing had changed. The ancient queen had awakened. The world was moving, and Marius was caught between his loyalty to the ancient past and his understanding of what the future might become. There was another reason Marius could not simply abandon his responsibility. He knew too much. He understood the origins of the vampire blood. He understood how powerful ancient vampires could become. He knew that the oldest creatures could influence the old world was disappearing. A new world was emerging, and Marius was carrying the secrets of both. He had watched Rome change. He had watched beliefs rise and fall. He had watched humanity transform itself. And now, he was approaching another transformation. The vampire world would eventually encounter new generations, new creatures, new ideas, new threats, and Marius would become part of their stories. But before that happened, he still had one enormous responsibility: the Ancient Ones. He had protected them for generations beyond counting, and he had no reason to believe that duty would end peacefully, because somewhere beneath the silence, the ancient blood was waiting, and one day it would awaken. When that happened, Marius would have to face a question he had spent centuries avoiding. What happens when the thing you have protected for ages becomes the greatest danger you have ever known? The answer was coming, and Marius would not be able to hide from it forever. For centuries, Marius had lived with the knowledge that the vampire world was built upon secrets. Some secrets were small. Some belonged to individual vampires, and some were so ancient that almost no one remained who truly understood them. Akasha was one of those secrets. Marius had spent ages protecting her and Engel. He had watched over them while human civilization changed around them. He had guarded their resting place. He had treated his duty as something almost sacred. But eventually, the silence ended. Akasha awakened, and when she returned to the world, Marius discovered that the ancient vampire he had protected for so long was no longer simply a figure from the distant past. She had a will. She had desires. And she had ideas about the future of vampires. Akasha believed vampires should no longer remain hidden. She wanted power. She wanted influence. And she wanted the world of humans to change. Marius was confronted with something he had never wanted to face. The being he had protected could become a threat. For centuries, Marius had believed that preserving the Ancient Ones was his responsibility. Now he had to question whether protecting them had been enough. Akasha's awakening was not simply a personal event. It affected the vampire world. Her presence reminded ancient vampires of the power that existed in their blood, and it drew attention from others who had spent centuries living in secrecy. Marius understood the danger. The vampire world could not simply follow Akasha without consequences. Humans vastly outnumbered vampires. If vampires openly ruled over humanity, the balance between the two species could collapse. But Akasha did not see the world that way. She believed power should belong to those strong enough to take it, and she intended to use her strength. Marius had to decide where he stood. He had lived long enough to understand that power could destroy the person holding it. He had seen rulers become tyrants. He had watched people who believed themselves invincible eventually fall. Akasha was different. She possessed an ancient power that made ordinary rulers seem insignificant. And now, she wanted to use it. Marius was no longer simply a guardian. He had become a witness to a dangerous transformation. The vampire world was entering a new age, and Marius knew that his own history was about to become connected to vampires far younger than himself. One of those vampires would eventually become extraordinarily important. His name was Lestat. But before that connection fully developed, Marius continued trying to understand what Akasha intended. He could not simply erase her. He could not undo centuries of history, and he could not pretend that nothing had changed. The ancient queen had awakened. The world was moving, and Marius was caught between his loyalty to the ancient past and his understanding of what the future might become. There was another reason Marius could not simply abandon his responsibility. He knew too much. He understood the origins of the vampire blood. He understood how powerful ancient vampires could become. He knew that the oldest creatures could influence the younger ones, and he knew that the wrong decision could affect generations. So he watched. He waited. He searched for a way to protect what mattered without allowing destruction to spread. But history was already moving beyond his control. Akasha's ambitions brought other vampires into conflict. Old relationships were tested. Ancient alliances began to fracture. And Marius found himself facing the consequences of decisions made long before his own birth. That was one of the cruelest things about immortality. You could inherit consequences from people who had died thousands of years earlier. You could become responsible for secrets you had never created. You could spend centuries trying to repair damage that began before you existed. Marius understood this better than most, and still, he remained. He did not abandon knowledge. He did not abandon beauty. He did not abandon his fascination with humanity, even while the vampire world became more dangerous. He continued believing that immortality could mean something more than violence. That belief would eventually shape the way he interacted with younger vampires. He became a teacher, a protector, a source of knowledge, because he knew what it meant to enter the vampire world without understanding anything. He had once been human too. He remembered the confusion, the hunger, the fear, the discovery that the world was much larger than he had imagined. And now, he had centuries of knowledge to offer others, but teaching younger vampires came with another problem. They were often fascinated by power. Marius understood why. Immortality could make you believe that nothing could hurt you. It only gives you more time to discover your weaknesses. And Marius had discovered many of his attachment to others, his loyalty, his curiosity, his desire to preserve the past, his hope that ancient secrets could be controlled. All of these things had shaped him, and all of them could also be used against him. The world around Marius continued changing. Humanity entered new centuries. New cities appeared. New technologies emerged. The old world became almost unrecognizable. But Marius adapted. He continued learning. He continued watching. He continued existing between the ancient past and the modern world. And eventually, his path would cross more directly with the vampire who had already begun attracting attention. Lestat, a younger vampire, rebellious, curious, dangerously independent. Marius would recognize something in him, not simply power, possibility, but that meeting still lay ahead. For now, Marius was standing in the aftermath of an ancient awakening. The world had changed. Akasha was no longer silent. The vampire world could no longer pretend the ancient past was safely buried. And Marius, The scholar who had spent centuries protecting forgotten history was about to become part of a new chapter. A chapter in which ancient vampires, younger immortals, and the future of the vampire world would collide. And when that collision came, Marius would have to decide what kind of immortal he truly wanted to be: a guardian of the past or a protector of the future. Marius had lived for centuries. He had watched empires disappear. He had watched languages change. He had watched humans build new worlds over the ruins of old ones. And through all of it, he had remained fascinated by one thing: the human mind. Even after becoming a vampire, Marius never completely lost his curiosity about humanity. Perhaps that was why he did not become consumed entirely by violence. He wanted to understand. He wanted to preserve. He wanted to teach. And eventually, those qualities would make him important to a younger generation of vampires. One of them was Lestat. Lestat was very different from Marius. He was younger, impulsive, rebellious, and unwilling to accept the limitations that others placed upon him. Where Marius had spent centuries collecting knowledge, Lestat wanted experience. Where Marius valued caution, Lestat often valued freedom. Their differences could have kept them apart. Instead, they became connected. Marius recognized something unusual in Lestat: curiosity, intelligence, and a refusal to simply accept what he was told. Marius understood that quality. After all, he had once been a seeker himself. But Marius also knew something Lestat had not yet learned. Immortality gives you time, but time does not automatically give you wisdom. Wisdom comes from what you do with that time. Marius had learned through centuries of watching the world change. He had seen the consequences of arrogance. He had seen what happened when vampires treated humans as nothing more than prey. He had seen how easily power could become cruelty. And he wanted younger vampires to understand that immortality did not remove responsibility. It increased it. So Marius became a teacher. He shared knowledge. He explained the history of vampires. He helped younger immortals understand their abilities, and he tried to show them that the world was larger than the narrow existence of hunting and survival. But teaching Lestat was never going to be simple. Lestat wanted answers. He wanted to know where vampires came from. He wanted to understand their powers. He wanted to know what ancient beings knew. And Marius had knowledge that few others possessed. But even Marius did not know everything. There were mysteries older than himself. Questions surrounding the origins of the vampire blood. Questions surrounding Akasha. Questions surrounding the mysterious force connected to the ancient ones. Marius could explain much, but not everything. That was another lesson of immortality. Even after centuries, you can still discover something you don't understand. And perhaps that is what kept Marius from becoming completely arrogant. He knew there were always deeper layers, but his relationship with Lestat would become especially important because Lestat's curiosity eventually brought him closer to ancient vampire history. Marius understood the danger. Ancient knowledge was not harmless. Some truths could change the way a vampire understood existence. Some discoveries could create obsession, and some could awaken forces that should never have been disturbed. Marius had already seen what happened when ancient power returned. Akasha's awakening had changed everything. The vampire world could no longer simply pretend that the oldest secrets were irrelevant. The younger vampires were becoming more curious. They wanted answers. They wanted history. And Marius had to decide how much of the truth they were ready to hear. He did not want to lie, but he also understood that knowledge without wisdom could become dangerous. So he taught carefully. He showed Lestat that vampires had a history far older than most could imagine. He explained that the oldest vampires were not myths. They had existed. They had influenced generations, and their blood was connected to powers that younger vampires could barely comprehend. Lestat listened, and the relationship between teacher and student became part of Marius's long legacy. But Marius's story was not simply about teaching others. He continued living through the modern world. The world around him became increasingly unfamiliar compared with the ancient civilizations he had known. Technology transformed human life. Cities grew larger. Travel became faster. Information spread almost instantly. Humans could communicate across enormous distances. The world had become connected in ways Marius could never have imagined during his human lifetime. Yet something remained unchanged. Humans still loved, still feared, still fought, still created, still searched for meaning. Marius recognized the pattern. Civilization changed. Human nature remained surprisingly familiar. And that may have been why he continued to care about humanity. He had lived long enough to watch countless generations repeat the same emotional struggles. Different clothing, different languages, different technology, but the same desire for love, the same fear of death, the same hunger for power, the same need to belong. Marius understood that immortality had not made him separate from humanity. It had simply given him more time to observe it, and perhaps that was his greatest gift. Perspective. He had lived through enough centuries to understand that almost nothing remained permanent. A political crisis that seemed like the end of the world eventually became a forgotten paragraph. A powerful ruler became a name. A magnificent city became ruins. A personal tragedy that once seemed unbearable became another memory. Time changed everything, except the fact that time itself kept moving. Marius knew this better than almost anyone. He also knew that immortality could become meaningless if you stopped learning. So he continued, he collected, he studied, he observed, he taught, and he remained connected to the vampire world. But his story had also taught him something darker. No matter how much knowledge you possess, you cannot control the future. You can protect someone. You can warn them. You can teach them. But eventually, they make their own choices. Marius could guide younger vampires. He could share his experience. He could tell them about the dangers he had witnessed. But he could not live their lives for them. That was especially true for Lestat. Lestat would eventually make choices that Marius could not control, and those choices would lead him into conflicts involving ancient vampires, powerful bloodlines, and secrets that had been hidden for centuries. Marius could only watch. The teacher could give knowledge. The student had to decide what to do with it. And perhaps that was the final lesson Marius had learned after living so long. Immortality is not really about living forever. It is about what you leave behind in the minds of those who continue after you. A book, a painting, a memory, a lesson, a person whose life changed because you were there. Those things can outlive even an immortal. Marius had once been a human scholar, searching for knowledge. He became a vampire. He became a guardian. He became a lover. He became a collector. He became a teacher. And through every transformation, one thing remained. He never stopped searching for understanding. His story began in the ancient world. It survived the rise and fall of civilizations. It passed through centuries of darkness, and it eventually reached a world that looked nothing like the one in which he had been born. Yet Marius remained, not simply as an ancient vampire, but as a living memory of history itself. He had seen humanity at its worst. He had seen it at its most beautiful. He had watched immortals become monsters. He had watched monsters discover compassion. And after all those centuries, he understood something that no amount of power could change. Even an immortal life is defined by choices. What you protect, what you destroy, what you remember, what you teach, and who you become. Marius could not change the centuries behind him. He could only carry them. And so he continued forward, carrying ancient memories into a modern world. The vampire who had once been a scholar had become something far greater, a guardian of forgotten history, a keeper of dangerous knowledge, and a teacher whose influence would continue through vampires who came long after him. His story was not over, because for someone like Marius, there was no ordinary ending. There was only another century, another secret, another night, and another chapter waiting in the darkness. Marius had spent centuries learning one simple truth. The older a secret became, the more dangerous it was to reveal. He had lived long enough to watch legends become history. He had seen stories change as they passed from one generation to another. A real event became a rumor became a myth, and eventually, the truth disappeared beneath everything people believed. But some secrets did not disappear. They waited. Marius knew this better than anyone, because he had spent centuries protecting one of the oldest secrets in existence, the ancient vampires, Akasha, Enkil, and the blood that connected them to the beginning of his kind. But Marius's life had changed. He was no longer simply a guardian watching over an ancient mystery. He had become a teacher. And through that role, he became connected to younger vampires who wanted answers. They wanted to know where they came from. They wanted to understand their powers. They wanted to know what existed before them. And among those vampires, Lestat's curiosity was especially dangerous. Lestat did not seem satisfied with simple answers. He wanted the truth. Marius understood that hunger, after all, he had once been exactly the same. But Marius had learned something Lestat had not yet fully understood. There are questions that change you when you discover the answer. Some knowledge cannot be forgotten. Once you know it, you can never return to ignorance. Marius knew this because his own existence was built around such knowledge. He knew that vampires had an ancient history. He knew that powerful beings had existed long before the modern world. He knew that the oldest vampires were connected to forces that younger immortals could barely comprehend. And he knew that some of these ancient beings had ambitions of their own. That was why Marius was careful. He did not want the younger generation to treat ancient knowledge like a game. Power could be fascinating, but power without understanding could become destruction. Marius had witnessed enough history to know this. He had watched rulers believe themselves immortal. He had watched empires become arrogant. He had watched people acquire power and then lose control of it. The same pattern existed among vampires. Immortality did not remove human weakness. It could magnify it. A selfish human could become an incredibly selfish immortal. An ambitious human could become dangerously ambitious. A frightened human could spend centuries hiding from the very thing they feared. And a person obsessed with power could become almost impossible to stop. Marius understood that, so he continued teaching. But there was another reason his knowledge mattered. He had lived through the world that younger vampires knew only through stories. He remembered ancient cultures. He remembered places before they became ruins. He remembered people whose names had disappeared from human history. He remembered the world before modern civilization. His memories were living history, and he preserved them. For Marius, collecting art and knowledge was not simply a hobby. It was resistance against forgetting. Time destroys almost everything. Stone breaks, paper decays, buildings collapse, languages disappear, people die. Even memories become uncertain. Marius fought against that process. He kept what he could, and in doing so, he created something rare, a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. But the longer Marius lived, the more he understood that preservation could never be perfect. You can save a painting, you can save a book, you can save a story, but you cannot save the world that created them. That world is gone. And that realization carried a strange sadness. Marius could walk through a modern city and remember what stood there centuries earlier. He could see a road and remember when there was no road. He could look at a building and remember another structure that had occupied the same place. Human beings lived inside the present. Marius lived partly inside the past. Everywhere he went, history followed him, and perhaps that was one reason he became so attached to beauty. Beauty gave him something time could not completely destroy. A painting could survive its painter. A piece of music could survive its composer. A story could survive the person who first told it. Marius understood that immortality was not the only way to survive. Creation could survive too. That idea became increasingly important as the centuries moved forward, because Marius had begun to understand that his own immortality would eventually mean something beyond simply continuing to exist. His actions would influence others. His knowledge would pass from one vampire to another. His lessons would continue, and through those who learned from him, parts of Marius would survive. But there was another shadow over his existence. Akasha. The ancient queen remained a presence that could never be ignored. Her awakening had already changed the vampire world. Her ambitions had revealed what could happen when an ancient power decided to act. Marius had once been her guardian. Now, he had to live with the consequences of everything connected to her. He understood that ancient history was never truly dead. It could return, and when it returned, it could demand something from the living. That was why Marius remained cautious. He knew too much to believe that the past was harmless. The vampire world continued evolving. New vampires appeared. Old vampires disappeared. Some sought knowledge. Others sought power. Some wanted freedom. Others wanted control. And Marius remained somewhere between them. He was ancient enough to understand the past, but curious enough to remain interested in the future. That made him unusual. He could have become completely detached. Instead, he kept watching humanity. He kept learning. He kept creating. He kept teaching. And he kept searching for meaning in a life that had already lasted far longer than any human life should. But there was something Marius could never escape. Time. Even immortals are shaped by it. Every century changed him. Every loss left something behind. Every relationship taught him something. Every mistake became part of his memory. He was no longer the young scholar who had first entered the darkness. That man was still inside him somewhere, but buried beneath centuries of experience. Marius had become a collection of lives, a collection of places, a collection of memories, a collection of people he had loved and lost. And yet, he continued, because perhaps that was the real meaning of immortality, not living without endings, but learning how to continue after them. Marius had lost people. He had lost worlds. He had lost relationships. He had watched entire eras disappear. Still, he walked forward. Still, he searched. Still, he remained curious. And somewhere ahead, another chapter was waiting. The younger vampires were becoming more connected to the ancient secrets. Lestat's journey was moving toward Marius, and the hidden history of the vampire world was beginning to surface again. Marius could feel that something was changing. The past was no longer sleeping quietly. The old secrets were beginning to move, and when they finally collided with the present, Marius would discover that even after centuries of preparation, there were some things no immortal could truly control. Marius had lived through too many centuries to believe that the past ever truly disappeared. It only became quieter. A forgotten face could return in a memory. An old wound could reopen. A name that had not been spoken for hundreds of years could suddenly matter again. And for Marius, the past was everywhere. He carried it inside him. He had been human once. He had known the ordinary limits of a human life. He had known that people grew old, that seasons changed, that one generation followed another, then immortality had taken all of those limits away. At first, that seemed like freedom. But after centuries, Marius understood that endless life could become another kind of prison. You cannot simply leave your past behind when you have centuries to remember it. Every person you loved remains somewhere inside your memory. Every mistake, every loss, every place, every face. Nothing completely disappears, and Marius had accumulated more memories than almost anyone could carry. Yet there was one memory that remained more important than all the others. The ancient ones, Akasha and Engel. For centuries, Marius had guarded them. Their existence had shaped his understanding of the vampire world. They were connected to a history far older than his own. And because Marius knew their importance, he also understood why their awakening was so dangerous. Akasha was not content simply to exist. She wanted a new world, a world in which vampires would no longer hide, a world in which the strongest would rule. Marius could understand the temptation of such power. He simply did not believe it was the answer. He had watched humanity for centuries. He had seen what happened when powerful people convinced themselves that they were entitled to rule everyone else. At first, they promised order, then protection, then greatness. Eventually, fear. Marius knew the pattern. Power rarely remained satisfied. It always wanted more. That was why he valued knowledge more than domination. He wanted to understand the world, not own it. But ancient vampires did not always agree. And as the vampire world changed, Marius found himself surrounded by younger immortals who wanted answers. They wanted to know their origins. They wanted to understand the oldest vampires. They wanted to know what powers existed beyond their own. Among them was Lestat. Lestat was unlike Marius. He was restless, curious, unwilling to accept silence as an answer. And Marius recognized that quality immediately. He had been curious too. The difference was that Marius had centuries of experience warning him about where curiosity could lead. Lestat had not yet lived long enough to understand the consequences. So Marius taught him. Not everything, but enough. He showed him that the vampire world was much older than the stories most vampires knew. He showed him that immortality had a history, and he showed him that power was not the same thing as wisdom. Lestat listened, but Lestat was never the kind of person who could remain satisfied forever. He wanted to see. He wanted to experience. He wanted to discover. And eventually, the paths of the ancient vampires and the younger generation would become impossible to separate. Marius understood that this was dangerous, but he also understood something else. You cannot keep someone ignorant forever, simply because knowledge might hurt them. Eventually, they will search for the truth themselves, and when they do, they may find it without anyone there to guide them. So Marius continued teaching. He became a bridge between generations, between the ancient world and the modern one, between vampires who remembered forgotten civilizations and vampires who had been born into a completely different age. That role came with responsibility, because every lesson could change someone, Every secret could become dangerous. Every piece of knowledge could be used for good or destruction. Marius knew this better than anyone. He had seen civilization create beauty. He had also seen civilization destroy itself. He had watched humans use intelligence to build magnificent things, and then use that same intelligence to create weapons. The problem was never simply knowledge. The problem was what someone wanted to do with it. That was why Marius cared so much about character. A powerful vampire with wisdom could protect others. A powerful vampire without restraint could destroy them. And Marius had seen enough to know that immortality did not automatically make anyone wise. Sometimes it simply gave a foolish person more time to make mistakes. Still, Marius continued searching for meaning. He created, he collected, he taught, he preserved, and he remained fascinated by human civilization. Modern humanity moved faster than the world Marius had known in his youth. Machines changed how people lived. Cities grew. Communication became almost instantaneous. The human world was becoming something ancient Marius could never have predicted. But beneath the technology, he recognized the same humanity. People still fell in love, still feared death, still wanted recognition, still searched for belonging, still fought over power, still dreamed of becoming something greater than themselves. Thousands of years could change civilization, but human emotions remained remarkably familiar. That realization gave Marius a strange perspective. He was ancient, but he was still learning, and perhaps that was why he never completely surrendered to cynicism. He had seen terrible things, but he had also seen extraordinary beauty. A human painting could move him. A piece of music could awaken memories centuries old. A simple act of kindness could remind him why humanity was worth protecting. Immortality had not erased his connection to the human world. If anything, it had deepened it. Because Marius had seen humanity across thousands of years, he knew how fragile it was. And perhaps that was why he continued preserving its achievements. He understood that one day, everything he saw could disappear. The buildings, the books, the paintings, the people, even the civilizations that believed themselves permanent. Nothing was guaranteed, except change. And Marius had become an expert at surviving change. But surviving was not the same as living. That was a lesson he continued struggling with. What does it mean to live when your life has no natural ending? What gives meaning to 1,000 years? What gives meaning to another 1,000? Marius could not answer completely, so he continued creating meaning through what he did, through knowledge, through relationships, through beauty, through teaching, through protecting what he believed mattered. And perhaps that was enough. But the vampire world was moving toward another major turning point. Lestat's story was becoming increasingly connected to the ancient vampires. The secrets Marius had protected were no longer safely hidden. The younger generation was beginning to discover pieces of the truth, and once the truth began spreading, there would be no easy way to put it back into darkness. Marius could feel the change. The ancient world was reaching into the modern one. The past was touching the present, And the vampire who had spent centuries trying to preserve history was about to discover something terrifying. Sometimes you can protect a secret for thousands of years and still be unable to control what happens when the world finally discovers it. Marius had survived empires. He had survived wars. He had survived the loss of people he loved. He had survived the transformation from human to vampire. But the greatest test of his immortal life was not simply surviving. It was deciding what kind of creature he wanted to remain after having lived long enough to become almost anything. And that answer would be written in the centuries still waiting ahead. Marius had spent most of his immortal existence looking backward, not because he was trapped in the past, but because the past was still alive inside him. Every century had left something behind, a memory, a lesson, a loss, a person, a place. And now, as the modern world continued changing around him, Marius carried all of it forward. But the past was no longer something he could simply observe. It was coming back. The ancient secrets surrounding the vampire bloodline were becoming impossible to ignore. Akasha had awakened. The old balance had been disturbed, and younger vampires were beginning to discover pieces of a history that Marius had spent centuries protecting. This was especially true of Lestat. Lestat was not content to accept the vampire world as he found it. He wanted answers. He wanted to know where vampires came from. He wanted to understand the ancient ones. And he wanted to know what existed beyond the ordinary limits of his own existence. Marius understood that hunger, but he also knew how dangerous it could become. Knowledge gives you power, but knowledge can also destroy the comfort of ignorance. Once you discover the truth, you cannot unknow it. Marius had learned that lesson thousands of years earlier. Now Lestat was beginning to learn it too. Their connection became increasingly important. Marius could offer something few others could: perspective. He had lived through centuries that younger vampires knew only as legends. He understood that the vampire world was not created in a single moment. It was the result of countless events, countless transformations, countless choices. And at the center of that history were the oldest beings, Akasha and Enkil. Their existence was connected to the origins of vampire power. Their blood had influenced generations. Their story had become part of the foundation of vampire history. And Marius had spent centuries guarding them. But now, the secret was no longer safely hidden. The vampire world was changing, and Marius found himself forced to confront something he had avoided for a very long time. He could not control the future. He could teach. He could warn. He could protect. But he could not decide what every other immortal would do. That was perhaps the hardest lesson of his existence. You can possess enormous knowledge and still have very little control. Marius had watched humans make the same mistake. Kings believed their kingdoms would last forever. Generals believed their victories were permanent. Rulers believed their power could never disappear. Then time proved them wrong. Marius knew better. He had seen too much. Everything changes, even immortals. The ancient vampire world was no exception. As younger vampires became more aware of their history, old secrets began to lose their power. Mystery became knowledge, rumor became fact, and legends became memories. Marius remained one of the few vampires who could connect those pieces together, but knowledge carried another burden: responsibility. If Marius revealed too much, he could put others in danger. If he revealed too little, younger vampires might make dangerous discoveries without guidance. He had to find a balance, and balance was becoming harder to maintain. The world around him was moving faster. Humans were changing rapidly. Their cities were growing. Their technology was transforming everyday life. The ancient world that Marius remembered seemed impossibly distant. Yet Marius could still close his eyes and remember it. He could remember streets that no longer existed, voices that had been silent for centuries, faces that belonged to people no human alive could remember. He carried an entire vanished world inside himself. That was both his greatest treasure and his greatest burden, because memory can be beautiful, but memory can also hurt, especially when you remember people who cannot remember you. Marius had learned to live with that pain. He had no choice. Immortality does not allow you to escape loss. It simply gives you more time to experience it. And yet, Marius continued to care. That was what made him different. He could have become completely detached. He could have looked at humans as temporary creatures and nothing more. Instead, he continued protecting beauty. He continued preserving knowledge. He continued forming relationships. He continued teaching. Even after thousands of years, he had not completely abandoned the human part of himself. And that mattered, because the greatest danger for an immortal is not death. It is becoming unable to care about anything. If nothing matters, then endless life becomes empty. Marius refused to let that happen. He found a meaning in learning, meaning in art, meaning in relationships, meaning in teaching those who came after him. And that was why his connection with Lestat mattered so much. Lestat represented a new generation, a vampire who had entered immortality in a very different age, a vampire who wanted to understand the world rather than simply accept it. Marius could see the potential, but he could also see the danger. Curiosity could lead to wisdom or obsession. Freedom could lead to independence or destruction. Power could protect or dominate. Everything depended on choice. Marius could not choose for Lestat. He could only teach, and so he continued. But the ancient conflict was becoming larger. The secrets surrounding Akasha were no longer simply ancient history. They were becoming part of the present. And as those secrets surfaced, Marius had to confront the possibility that everything he had spent centuries protecting could be changed in a single moment. The ancient ones had survived for ages. Their blood had survived. Their influence had survived. But survival did not mean permanence. Marius knew that better than anyone. He had watched civilizations disappear. He had watched people become legends. He had watched entire worlds become memories. And now, he was watching the vampire world approach another turning point. The old order was weakening. The younger generation was becoming more powerful. Ancient secrets were spreading, and Marius stood between them, not as a king, not as a conqueror, but as a witness, a teacher, a guardian, an immortal who had lived long enough to understand that history never truly stays buried. Eventually, something always returns, a memory, a secret, a forgotten name, a buried truth. And when it returns, someone has to decide what to do with it. Marius had spent his entire existence preparing for that responsibility, but preparation could not guarantee success. The future was coming, and this time, Marius would not simply be watching history, he would be caught inside it. The ancient blood had already awakened. The younger vampires were already searching for answers, and the secrets that had survived for thousands of years were finally beginning to reach the surface. Marius had guarded the darkness for his centuries. Now, he would have to face what was waiting inside it. Marius had discovered something during his endless existence. Immortality does not remove the past. It makes the past impossible to escape. Every century remained somewhere inside him. Every person he had known, every place he had visited, every relationship that had ended, every lesson he had learned. Nothing was completely forgotten. And now, after so many centuries, Marius was no longer simply a vampire who had survived history. He had become part of it. His life connected the ancient world to the modern one. He remembered things that existed only in stories. He had seen civilizations while they were alive, long before they became ruins. He had watched human beings change their understanding of the world again and again. And through all of it, he had remained fascinated by them. That fascination was one of the few things that kept him from becoming completely detached. Because immortality can slowly change the way you see other people. When everyone around you is temporary, it becomes tempting to stop becoming attached. Why love someone who will eventually die? Why build something that time will eventually destroy? Why care about a civilization that may disappear? Marius could have accepted that philosophy. He did not. Instead, he chose to care. He collected art. He preserved knowledge. He taught younger vampires. He formed relationships. He continued searching for meaning. Those choices gave his endless existence purpose, but they also made immortality painful, because caring means losing. Marius knew this. He had experienced separation from people he loved. He had watched relationships change. He had watched generations disappear. And still, he continued opening himself to others. Perhaps that was his greatest act of rebellion against immortality itself. He refused to become empty. The vampire world around him was also changing. The old secrets were no longer safely contained. Younger vampires were discovering more. The history surrounding the ancient blood was becoming increasingly important, and Lestat stood at the center of that new generation. Marius understood that Lestat represented something different. He was not content to inherit the rules of older vampires. He questioned them. He pushed against them. He wanted to know more. That made him dangerous, but it also made him important. Marius knew that every generation needed someone willing to ask difficult questions. Without questions, knowledge becomes tradition, and tradition can become another form of ignorance. So Marius continued teaching, but there was a limit to what even he could explain. There were mysteries older than his own existence. The origins of the vampire blood remained connected to ancient forces. Akasha's existence remained a reminder that the oldest vampires were fundamentally different from the younger ones. And Marius had learned that the ancient world could never be treated casually. It had power, it had consequences, and it could return when least expected. That knowledge made Marius cautious, but it did not make him afraid of learning. Quite the opposite. He became even more determined to understand. That had always been his nature. Even when he was human, he had searched for knowledge. As a vampire, he simply had more time to search. Thousands of nights, thousands of years, more time than any human could imagine. But endless time created another problem. Eventually, you begin asking what all that time is actually for. Marius could have spent eternity collecting possessions. He could have pursued power. He could have ruled over humans. He could have isolated himself from the world. Instead, he continued engaging with it. That choice defined him. He did not want immortality merely to survive. He wanted immortality to experience, to learn, to understand, to preserve, to teach. That philosophy also shaped the way he viewed younger vampires. He understood their mistakes because he had made mistakes of his own. He understood their curiosity because he had once been curious. He understood their fear because he remembered being human. And he understood their hunger for power because immortality naturally created that temptation. But Marius had learned that power without restraint was dangerous. The strongest creature in the room was not necessarily the wisest. The oldest vampire was not necessarily the best. Age could create knowledge, but only experience and reflection could create wisdom. Marius had spent centuries learning that distinction, and now he tried to pass it forward. But the vampire world did not always listen. Some vampires wanted freedom. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted power. Some wanted answers. Others simply wanted to survive. Their desires collided, and Marius found himself watching the same patterns he had seen in human history. Different creatures, different centuries, the same ambitions, the same fears, the same mistakes. It was almost as if immortality had changed the length of life without changing the nature of desire. That realization fascinated Marius. Humans and vampires were not as different as vampires like to believe. Both could be selfish. Both could be compassionate. Both could love. Both could become cruel. The difference was that vampires had much more time to experience the consequences. And Marius had experienced enough consequences for several lifetimes. He carried them quietly. They had shaped his character. They had taught him patience. They had taught him caution. They had taught him that nothing should be taken for granted. But most importantly, they had taught him that immortality was not the absence of endings, it was the accumulation of them. Relationships ended, eras ended, civilizations ended, beliefs ended, even identities could change. The person you were centuries ago could become almost unrecognizable. Marius understood that. He had begun as a human. Then he became a vampire, then a guardian, then a companion, then a teacher. Each stage left something behind. None of them completely disappeared. They simply became part of the whole. And that was what made Marius so difficult to understand. He was not only one thing, he was the sum of centuries, a human memory inside an immortal body, a scholar surrounded by supernatural power, a guardian carrying ancient secrets, a teacher trying to prepare younger vampires for a world he knew could not be controlled. But there was still one question waiting for him. After everything he had seen, what would he ultimately leave behind? Marius could not stop history. He could not prevent every tragedy. He could not protect everyone. He could not control the choices of other immortals. But he could leave knowledge behind. He could teach. He could preserve. He could remind younger vampires that their existence had a history. And perhaps that was enough, because immortality was never really about becoming permanent. Nothing is permanent, not even memory. The real question was whether your existence could change something beyond yourself. Marius had already done that. His knowledge had passed to others. His influence had reached younger vampires. His understanding of ancient history had become part of the knowledge carried forward. And as the modern world continued racing into the future, Marius remained a living connection to everything that had come before. But the story of the ancient vampires was not finished. The secrets surrounding Akasha were still dangerous. Lestat's journey was still unfolding, and Marius still had a role to play. The scholar had become a guardian. The guardian had become a teacher. And the teacher was now watching a new generation step into a world filled with secrets he had spent centuries trying to understand. Marius had survived the ancient world. He had survived change. He had survived loss. But the greatest question was no longer whether he could survive another century. He already knew he could. The question was, what would he do with it? And as another night descended over the world, Marius continued walking forward, still searching, still learning, still remembering, still immortal. But now, he understood the true price of living forever. You do not simply carry your own life. You carry everything you refuse to forget. There comes a point in an immortal life when centuries stop feeling like separate chapters. They begin to blend together. One age becomes another. One city replaces another. One generation disappears, and another takes its place. Marius had lived long enough to see this happen, more times than he could count. He had watched the world transform around him. He had watched humans build civilizations, destroy them, rebuild them, and forget what had existed before. And through every change, he remained. But remaining alive was no longer enough. Marius had begun to understand that an endless life needed purpose. Otherwise, immortality became nothing more than repetition. night after night, century after century. The same hunger, the same darkness, the same endless existence. Marius refused to let his life become that empty. He chose knowledge. He chose beauty. He chose relationships. And most importantly, he chose to teach. The younger vampires who came into his life did not possess what he possessed. They had a power. They had immortality. But they did not have his memories. They had never watched the ancient world disappear. They had never seen civilizations from the inside. They had never carried thousands of years of history in their minds. Marius could give them something more valuable than power. He could give them perspective. That was why his relationship with younger vampires mattered. He wanted them to understand that being immortal did not make them superior. It simply made them responsible for more. Every action could have consequences that lasted longer than a human lifetime. Every secret could travel through generations. Every decision could influence vampires who had not even been born yet. Marius knew this because he had watched history work that way. One decision could change everything. One mistake could become a tragedy remembered for centuries. One act of compassion could also survive long after the person who performed it was gone. That was the strange beauty of history. You never knew what would survive. Marius had spent centuries trying to preserve the things he believed mattered. But now he understood something deeper. Preservation was not enough. Someone had to understand what was being preserved. A book without anyone willing to read it was only an object. A painting without someone capable of seeing its meaning was only an image. A memory without someone to carry it forward could disappear. So Marius taught. He passed knowledge from one immortal mind to another. He became a living connection between generations. And perhaps that was his greatest achievement. Not his age, not his strength, not his supernatural abilities. His influence. Because influence can survive even when the person who created it disappears. Marius had seen this happen with humans. A writer dies. The book remains. A teacher dies. The student continues teaching. An artist dies. The work survives. A civilization disappears. Its ideas continue inside the civilizations that follow. Immortality could take many forms. Marius's body might survive indefinitely. But so could the things he gave others. That realization changed the way he viewed his existence. He no longer needed to prove that he could live forever. He already knew that. Instead, he wanted his endless existence to mean something. And that meant continuing to care. Even when caring was painful. Especially when it was painful. Because Marius had learned that detachment was easy. Caring was difficult. Love was difficult. Friendship was difficult. Trust was difficult. They all created opportunities for loss. But without them, immortality became hollow. Marius chose the harder path. He continued forming connections. He continued allowing other people into his life, and every relationship left something behind. Some became memories. Some became lessons. Some became regrets. But none were meaningless. Even loss could teach. Even heartbreak could change you. Even failure could become part of wisdom. That was something Marius understood after centuries. You do not become wise simply because you become old. You become wise when you are willing to learn from what happened to you. And Marius had experienced enough to fill entire libraries. He had made mistakes. He had trusted people. He had lost people. He had loved. He had been separated from those he cared about. He had watched the world change beyond recognition. Yet he continued. That continuation became his strength, not because he was incapable of suffering, but because suffering had not destroyed his ability to care. The ancient secrets still remained. Akasha's history remained. The origins of the vampire blood remained. The younger generation continued searching for answers. And Marius remained one of the few beings capable of connecting those pieces together. But he also understood that no guardian could protect everything forever. Secrets eventually escape. History eventually becomes known. People eventually make their own decisions. You can guide someone, but you cannot control them. You can warn someone, but you cannot force them to listen. You can give someone knowledge, but you cannot choose how they use it. That was the limit of Marius's power. And perhaps accepting that limit was another part of his wisdom. He did not need to control the future. He only needed to contribute to it. That was enough. The centuries continued. Humanity moved forward. The vampire world continued changing. And Marius remained somewhere between the ancient past and the modern age. A living memory. A guardian. A teacher. A witness. His story had become far larger than the moment when he first became a vampire. It had become a story about what happens when someone is given more time than any human being could ever imagine. At first, you think immortality is about escaping death. Then you realize it is about facing everything else. Loss, loneliness, change, responsibility, memory, and eventually, meaning. Marius had spent centuries searching for that meaning. He found pieces of it in art, pieces in knowledge, pieces in relationships, pieces in teaching, and perhaps most importantly, he found it in continuing to care about a world that would eventually move on without him. That was the paradox of his existence. He could survive almost anything, but he could not stop the world from changing. He could preserve memories, but he could not preserve the people who created them. He could protect ancient secrets, but he could not control what others would do with them. He could teach younger vampires, but he could not live their lives for them. So Marius did what he had always done. He continued forward. Another night, another century, another generation, still learning, still observing, still carrying the weight of everything he had seen. And somewhere inside all those memories, the human he once was still remained, not completely forgotten, not completely gone, just buried beneath centuries of experience. That human curiosity had survived. That desire to understand had survived. And perhaps that was the most important thing Marius had protected. Not merely the ancient vampires, not merely the history, but a part of himself. The part that still believed life was worth understanding. The the part that still found beauty in the world, the part that still cared. And now, only one chapter remained, because after everything Marius had lived through, the final question was no longer how he became immortal. It was what his immortality ultimately meant. The answer had been forming for centuries, but it would become clear only when the story finally reached its end. Marius had lived longer than any human life could possibly contain. He had been born human. He had lived in the ancient world. He had searched for knowledge. And then he became a vampire. From that moment forward, time changed meaning. Years became decades. Decades became centuries. Centuries became a part of his memory. The world he had once known slowly disappeared. The people he had known became memories. The places he remembered changed beyond recognition. But Marius remained. For a long time, he believed that immortality was simply the ability to continue, to survive, to watch, to learn. But after centuries of existence, he understood that living forever was not the same as having a meaningful life. Meaning had to be created, and Marius created his through knowledge. He studied the world. He preserved its beauty. He collected its history. He remembered what others had forgotten. He protected ancient secrets. He became a guardian. And eventually, he became a teacher. His life became connected to generations of vampires who knew almost nothing about the ancient world he remembered. To them, history was a collection of stories. To Marius, history had been life. He had seen it. He had walked through it. He had watched it disappear. That gave him a responsibility. He could not preserve everything. No immortal could. But he could preserve something. A memory. A lesson. A work of art. A piece of knowledge. A warning. A story. And those things could travel farther than a single lifetime. That became the quiet purpose of his existence. Marius did not need to rule the world. He did not need every vampire to fear him. He did not need to prove that he was ancient. His greatest strength was understanding. He had learned that power without wisdom could become destruction. He had learned that knowledge without responsibility could become dangerous. He had learned that immortality without purpose could become emptiness. And he had learned that caring was painful, but necessary, because Marius had lost people. He had experienced separation. He had watched generations disappear. He had watched the world change again and again. Yet he never completely stopped caring. That was important. After thousands of years, he could have become cold. He could have decided that nothing mattered because everything eventually ended. Instead, he chose the opposite. He chose to value things precisely because they were temporary. A human life mattered because it was short. A relationship mattered because it could end. A beautiful moment mattered because it could never be repeated in exactly the same way. Marius understood that immortality did not make temporary things meaningless. It made them precious, and that realization changed how he looked at existence. He continued observing humanity. He continued learning from it. Humans built, humans destroyed, humans loved, humans feared, humans searched for answers, and despite everything, they continued. Marius recognized himself in that. He too had continued. Through loss, through change, through centuries of uncertainty, he had continued learning. That was perhaps the most human thing about him. Not his immortal body, not his supernatural abilities, his curiosity, his ability to wonder, his desire to understand. Those qualities had survived everything. The ancient world had disappeared. The modern world had replaced it. The vampire world had changed. Ancient secrets had surfaced. Younger vampires had come searching for answers. And Marius had remained a connection between them all. He was not simply a vampire from the distant past. He was a living record of what had come before. But eventually, even records become incomplete. Even memories fade. Even immortals cannot hold every detail forever. Marius understood that, and he accepted it. He no longer needed to preserve every moment. He only needed to preserve what mattered. The knowledge that could help another. The beauty that could inspire another. The lessons that could prevent another mistake. The memories worth carrying forward. That was enough. His relationship with the ancient vampire world had taught him about power. His relationships had taught him about love and loss. His centuries of observation had taught him about humanity. And his role as a teacher had taught him something even more important. You cannot live another person's life for them. You can guide. You can warn. You can share what you have learned. But eventually, everyone must choose their own path. Marius understood this, and he allowed others to make their choices. His life was not perfect. It was not without pain. It was not without mistakes. But perhaps perfection was never the point. A life that lasts forever can still be complicated. It can still contain regret. It can still contain love. It can still contain loneliness. It can still contain beauty. And Marius experienced all of it. That is what made his story more than a story about a vampire. It was a story about time, about what happens when one person is given far more of it than anyone was ever meant to have. At the beginning, Marius wanted knowledge. By the end, he had become knowledge. He carried centuries inside himself. He carried the memory of worlds that no longer existed. He carried the lessons of people who had been forgotten. And he carried the responsibility of passing some of that knowledge forward. The world would continue changing. New generations would arrive. Old generations would disappear. Civilizations would rise. Others would fall. Humanity would keep moving forward. And somewhere within that endless movement, Marius would remain a connection to everything that came before. Not because he had conquered time, but because he had learned how to live with it. That was the true lesson of his immortality. You cannot stop a change. You cannot prevent every loss. You cannot hold on to every person. You cannot preserve every moment. But you can choose what you carry forward. Marius chose knowledge. He chose beauty. He chose memory. He chose connection. And he chose to keep learning. For someone who had lived for centuries, perhaps that was enough. His story began with a human being searching for answers. It continued through darkness, immortality, ancient secrets, relationships, loss, and endless change. And after all those centuries, Marius remained what he had always been at heart, a seeker, still curious, still watching, still remembering, still trying to understand the world. The world around him would continue without him. It always had. And that was all right, because Marius had finally learned that immortality was not about stopping the world. It was about witnessing it. It was about learning from it. It was about carrying its memories and, whenever possible, leaving something meaningful behind. So the ancient vampire continues into the darkness of another night. No grand victory, no final battle, no dramatic ending, just the quiet continuation of an immortal existence, the centuries behind him, the unknown ahead, and an endless collection of memories within him. Marius de Romanus, the scholar who became a vampire, the guardian of ancient secrets, the teacher of younger immortals, and the keeper of memories that time tried to erase. His story does not end because he dies. It ends here, because the story has finally shown what his endless life came to mean. Not power, not conquest, not escape from death, but memory, knowledge, connection, and the courage to keep caring in a world where everything else eventually changes. And after centuries of darkness, Marius continues into the night, not searching for an ending, not searching for immortality, but simply living as vampire,